A father tried to publicly shame a woman into giving up her seat. But when the flight attendant took her side, the situation spiraled out of his control. Keisha Munro exhaled softly as she slid into her window seat in row 14 of the crowded Airbus A320. She had chosen it deliberately, paying extra for the comfort of the view and the peace it provided. The window was her escape, a small sanctuary in the midst of the usual chaos of air travel. With a long flight ahead, she had come prepared. A new novel, noise-cancelling headphones, and the simple expectation of being left alone. The cabin bustled with the last-minute shuffle of boarding passengers. Overhead compartments slammed shut. Flight attendants moved swiftly through the aisles, and the usual pre-flight announcements echoed over the intercom. Keisha adjusted her seatbelt and thumbed through the first few pages of her book, letting the hum of conversation around her fade into the background. She barely registered the father and child making their way down the aisle until they stopped right beside her. A deep voice cut through her concentration. Firm, expectant, a command masked as a request. "Excuse me, I need you to move." Keisha blinked, looking up. The man towering over her was middle-aged, well-dressed, and visibly impatient. His salt-and-pepper hair was neatly combed, his expensive wristwatch gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the way he held himself radiated entitlement, as if he were used to getting his way without question. Beside him stood a small girl, no older than 6, clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest. She had wide, nervous eyes and fidgeted with the hem of her sweater, avoiding Keisha's gaze. Keisha hesitated. "I'm sorry." The man sighed as if explaining something obvious. He gestured toward the empty aisle seat next to her. "My daughter needs the window seat. She gets anxious during flights," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Keisha's brows lifted slightly. She shifted her gaze between the man and the child. "I'm sorry," she said, keeping her voice even but firm. "I paid for this seat." For a brief moment, Richard Aldridge, she remembered his name from the frequent flyer tag pinned to his carry-on, looked genuinely surprised, as if the idea of someone telling him no was an entirely foreign concept. Then his expression hardened. "She's a child," he repeated, slower this time, as if Keisha hadn't understood him the first time. "Surely you understand?" Keisha pressed her lips together. She understood just fine. She understood that a grown man who could afford a Rolex and a first-class leather briefcase had somehow failed to plan ahead for his daughter's needs. She understood that he assumed she would accommodate him without question. And she understood that if she had been anyone else, a different age, a different race, his approach might have been different. Still, she kept her voice calm. "I do understand," she said. "But I also paid for my seat. If it was that important, you should have booked accordingly." Richard's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. Then louder, ensuring the people around them could hear, a calculated move, meant to paint her as the problem. He said, "This is what's wrong with people today. No basic decency." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, some turning their heads. A few stole quick glances at Keisha, their expressions a mix of curiosity and awkwardness. Keisha felt the heat rise in her face. She knew exactly what he was doing, and it made her stomach tighten. But before she could respond, a shadow moved into the aisle beside them. A flight attendant had arrived. But what happened next would catch everyone off guard. The flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense air, stopped beside them. Her navy blue uniform was perfectly pressed, her name tag reading Sandra Wallace. She glanced between Keisha and the man standing stiffly beside her, taking in the tension like a seasoned referee stepping into a brewing fight. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Before Keisha could speak, Richard Aldridge jumped in. "Yes," he said, crossing his arms. "This woman won't give up her seat for my daughter." Sandra's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if she was waiting for him to continue with the actual issue. Richard sighed dramatically, then motioned toward the little girl. She gets anxious during flights. She needs the window seat. I asked this young lady to switch, but she refused. Keisha watched Sandra closely, searching for any sign of bias or deference. Flight attendants had a difficult job, balancing customer satisfaction with airline policies, and sometimes that meant bending to the demands of the loudest passenger. But Sandra didn't look impressed. Her eyes flicked to Keisha. "You booked this seat?" Keisha nodded. "Yes." Sandra turned back to Richard. "Sir, she has the seat assigned to her." Richard scoffed. "I'm aware of that. I'm asking you to do the right thing and help us resolve this situation. Surely the airline values customer service." Sandra inhaled slowly, her patience wearing thin. "Sir, customer service doesn't mean forcing another passenger to move from a seat they paid for." Richard's face reddened, but he wasn't giving up that easily. "This isn't about rules," he said, his voice rising just enough to draw more eyes from surrounding passengers. "This is about decency, about kindness, about a grown woman refusing to accommodate a child." The way he said it, like Keisha was some kind of villain, sent a sharp pulse of frustration through her. Sandra, however, remained unshaken. "I understand your concern, sir," she said, unfazed by his theatrics. "If you need a window seat for your daughter, I'd be happy to check if there are any open ones available, but I won't ask another passenger to move from their assigned seat." Richard's jaw clenched. He turned to Keisha, eyes narrowing. "You really won't move? For a child?" Keisha met his gaze, her voice even but unwavering. "I paid for this seat," she repeated. "I'm staying in it." Richard let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. Then, looking around at the other passengers, he raised his voice. "Can you believe this?" he said to no one in particular. "A full-grown woman refusing to switch seats with a little girl?" Murmurs spread through the cabin. Some passengers avoided eye contact, clearly not wanting to get involved. Others watched with interest, waiting to see how things would unfold. Keisha felt a wave of discomfort settle over her. Not because she doubted her decision, but because this was exactly how people like Richard operated. He wasn't just trying to get a seat. He was trying to shame her into submission. And the worst part? It might work. Her hands tightened around her book. She could feel the weight of every stare, the expectation, the unspoken pressure to be the bigger person. But why was it always her who had to be the bigger person? Sandra must have sensed the shift because she stepped closer to Keisha, a subtle yet clear show of support. "Sir," she said, her voice low and firm, "I'm going to ask you one last time to take your assigned seat." Richard let out a sharp breath, his nostrils flaring, and then he muttered something under his breath. Keisha didn't catch the first part, but she caught the last word. Typical. Her stomach dropped. Sandra's entire posture changed. She stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a split second, the entire row seemed to go silent, as if everyone had heard it too. Keisha's pulse pounded in her ears. She had heard that word enough times to know exactly what it meant. And so had Sandra. The flight attendant straightened her shoulders, eyes locked on Richard, her calm professionalism replaced with something colder. "I'd advise you to be very careful with what you're implying," she said, her voice steely. The energy in the cabin shifted. The murmurs turned into whispers. But before anything else could be said, another voice entered the conversation, one that would change everything. A voice from the row behind them cut through the tension. "She said she paid for her seat." A man spoke up, his tone even but firm. Keisha turned slightly, catching a glimpse of the speaker. He was middle-aged, wearing a dark green hoodie and wire-rimmed glasses, sitting in an aisle seat with his arms crossed. He wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at Sandra, as if expecting her to shut this down once and for all. Sandra nodded slightly, acknowledging the support, but keeping her focus on Richard. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice," she said. Richard exhaled sharply, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what was happening. He turned his frustration toward the growing audience. "This is ridiculous," he said, gesturing around as if looking for allies. "No one here thinks it's wrong for a grown woman to refuse to switch seats with a 6-year-old. A few passengers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one else spoke up. That wasn't good enough for Richard. "This is the problem with society today," he continued, his voice loud enough to carry down the aisle. "People are so selfish, so unwilling to do something small to help someone else." Keisha felt a wave of anger rise in her chest, not just because of what he was saying, but because she could feel the unspoken pressure he was trying to build around her. She could see it in the way some passengers avoided looking at her directly, how some hesitated, as if considering his words. It would be so easy for them to side with him, to frame this as a matter of basic kindness, not entitlement. To make her the villain. Keisha took a slow breath, steadying herself. "I'm not selfish," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "I paid for this seat, just like everyone else here. If the seat was so important, you should have booked it ahead of time." The man in the green hoodie nodded slightly, as if satisfied with her response. Richard, however, was far from satisfied. "You have no shame, do you?" he muttered, his face flushing red with frustration. Keisha's grip on her book tightened, her fingers pressing into the cover. And then, a woman across the aisle spoke up. "She's right," the woman said, her voice carrying through the cabin. "Seats aren't assigned randomly. If you wanted the window, you should have booked it." Richard snapped his head toward her, his frustration shifting targets. "She's a child," he repeated, his voice fraying at the edges. "I shouldn't have to plan around selfish people." Keisha let out a quiet breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She had seen this tactic before. Twist the situation. Make it about morality. Make it about the bad person refusing to accommodate the good person. But something was shifting. More passengers were looking at Richard now, their expressions ranging from annoyed to outright irritated. Some whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. And Richard felt it. His confidence wavered just slightly. But before he could recover, Sandra stepped forward. "I need you to take your assigned seat now, sir," she said, her tone final. Richard hesitated. He was losing ground, and he knew it. But he wasn't ready to let go without one last attempt. He turned back to Keisha, his voice lower but laced with venom. "You know what? Keep your seat," he said. "I wouldn't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you anyway." The words hit harder than she expected. Keisha felt a cold, sharp anger rise in her chest, and she wasn't the only one who noticed. Sandra's posture stiffened instantly. "That's it," she said, her voice sharp with authority. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Richard blinked, thrown off. "What?" "You can either move to your assigned seat now, or we'll have to speak with the captain." A new kind of tension filled the air, the kind that came when someone realized they had pushed too far. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out, and for the first time since this started, he looked genuinely uncertain. But uncertainty wasn't the same as surrender. And Richard Aldridge was not the kind of man to surrender easily. Something was about to give. For a moment, Richard Aldridge just stood there, his face twisted between indignation and disbelief. He hadn't expected this. The pressure, the pushback, the sudden turn of the crowd. And now, with Sandra's voice firm and unwavering, the power he thought he had, it was slipping. "You want me to come with you?" he repeated, his voice lower now, as if he was testing how much authority she really had. Sandra didn't blink. "Yes, sir." Keisha could see the shift happening in real time, the way Richard's mind was working, calculating his next move. He knew he was dangerously close to making this situation so much worse for himself. But men like him, they didn't like losing. Instead of stepping aside, he played his last card. "I just find it interesting," he said, raising his voice again, "that you're siding with her. I bet if the roles were reversed, we'd be having a very different conversation. The air in the cabin thickened. Keisha felt her stomach twist, but she didn't react. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Sandra, however, was done playing. "Sir, I am warning you," she said, her tone dropping to something colder, sharper. "If you do not take your seat right now, I will have to notify the captain. And if that happens, I can't guarantee you'll remain on this flight." The murmurs grew louder now. Passengers were watching closely, leaning forward, whispering. And Richard? He felt it. For the first time, real consequences were on the horizon. He turned, looking down the aisle toward the cockpit, as if he could somehow gauge just how serious Sandra was. And then, something even worse happened for him. Another voice, a different flight attendant. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the same Navy uniform as Sandra, appeared behind her. His name tag read, "Javier. Is there an issue here?" he asked, his voice polite but edged with authority. Sandra didn't break eye contact with Richard. Not yet. But I was just explaining to this passenger that if he refuses to take his assigned seat, we'll need to escalate the situation. Javier's expression didn't change. But the weight of his presence? It shifted the entire energy of the moment. This wasn't just an argument between a passenger and a flight attendant anymore. This was now an official problem. Keisha watched it unfold, a silent observer to Richard's internal war. He wanted to fight this. Everything in him screamed to keep pushing. But now it wasn't just about pride. Now he was staring down the possibility of getting kicked off the plane. And that was a step too far. For the first time, his posture sagged slightly. It wasn't surrender. Not entirely, but it was acceptance. "Fine," he muttered. Then, without another word, he turned, gripping his daughter's hand a little too tightly, and stomped down the aisle to his seat. A few passengers let out small sighs of relief. Others shook their heads, exchanging knowing glances. Sandra exhaled slowly, composing herself before turning back to Keisha. "I'm sorry about that," she said, her voice gentler now. Keisha gave her a small, appreciative nod. "Not your fault." Sandra hesitated for just a second, then added, "If he bothers you again, let me know immediately." Keisha nodded again. Sandra and Javier stepped away, disappearing toward the front of the plane. For the first time since this started, Keisha felt her body relax slightly. But just as she was about to settle back into her book, a voice from across the aisle caught her attention. "You handled that well," the woman in the ponytail said, offering a small, knowing smile. Keisha let out a short breath, somewhere between a chuckle and a sigh. "I guess." But the woman shook her head. "No, seriously, a lot of people would have just moved to avoid the hassle. You didn't." Keisha didn't answer right away. Because truthfully, she had thought about it. There had been a moment, a real, undeniable moment, where she had felt the pressure to give in. To just move, let it go, make things easier. But she hadn't. And now it was over, or so she thought. But Richard Aldridge wasn't done just yet. Keisha let out a slow breath, adjusting in her seat, but the tension in her shoulders refused to fade. Even with Richard storming off, even with Sandra making it clear that she had done nothing wrong, there was something about the whole situation that left a bitter taste in her mouth. She glanced toward his seat, 4 rows ahead on the opposite side of the aisle. He was stiff in his chair, arms crossed, jaw tight. His daughter sat next to him, still clutching her stuffed rabbit. Quiet. Eyes down. Keisha felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe. The girl hadn't asked for any of this. She had just been dragged into her father's mess. But any sympathy she might have had vanished the second Richard turned his head, caught her gaze, and sneered. He mouthed something. Keisha didn't hear it, but she didn't have to. She knew the tone, knew the look. A sharp, dismissive shake of his head, like she was beneath him, like she was the problem. She turned back toward the window, gripping the armrest. She wasn't going to let him get to her. She refused. But then, he did something she didn't expect. Richard stood up. Passengers in his row glanced up, confused. A flight attendant near the front immediately took notice. "Sir, I need you to remain seated," she said, stepping toward him. Richard didn't listen. He walked right past her, down the aisle, toward Keisha. The shift in energy was instantaneous. Passengers turned their heads. Eyes tracked him. Sandra, who had been helping an elderly couple with their luggage, stiffened the second she saw him approaching. Keisha didn't move, didn't react, but her pulse kicked up, fast and sharp. What the hell was he doing? Richard stopped at her row, gripping the seat in front of her, leaning in just slightly. The tension was palpable. For a split second, it was just the two of them, locked in a silent battle. And then, he spoke. "You must be really proud of yourself." Keisha didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, she lifted a brow. "Excuse me?" Richard exhaled sharply, as if barely keeping himself in check. "You sit here pretending to be the victim," he muttered, his voice just low enough that only she could hear. "But we both know what's really going on." Keisha felt her fingers curl into the armrest. This wasn't about the seat anymore. It never had been. This was about control, about ego, about a man who had never been told no before and was unraveling because of it. Keisha parted her lips to respond, but before she could, Sandra's voice rang out. "Sir, step away from the passenger seat, now." The command was sharp, final. Richard didn't move. For a moment, Keisha thought he was going to push it further, escalate it to something worse. But then, Javier appeared again. And this time, he wasn't asking. "Sir, if you don't return to your seat immediately, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the aircraft." A collective hush settled over the cabin. Keisha could feel the weight of every single passenger's stare. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a scene. Richard's face burned red. For a second, he looked like he was about to argue, chest rising, lips parting. But then, he made a decision. With one last glare at Keisha, he muttered, "You're unbelievable." Then he turned on his heel and stormed back to his seat. Javier watched him the entire way. Sandra exhaled. "Are you okay?" Keisha finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm fine," she said, even though her hands were still tense. Sandra nodded once, then exchanged a look with Javier. And then, just as Javier reached for his radio, Richard made one final mistake. He muttered something, not loud enough for the whole plane, not loud enough for the passengers in front of him, but loud enough for Sandra and Javier to hear. Loud enough for Keisha to catch the sharp inhale Sandra took, the way Javier's expression shifted instantly. Javier didn't even hesitate. He raised his radio to his mouth. "Captain, we have a situation." And just like that, Richard Aldridge's flight was over before it even began. The tension inside the cabin thickened to the point of suffocation. Passengers stopped whispering. Some leaned forward in their seats, others craned their necks to see what would happen next. Javier's radio crackled. "Copy that. Hold him at the front until we can coordinate with ground staff." Keisha's heart pounded. Sandra and Javier moved quickly, stepping toward Richard, who was still rigid in his seat, eyes locked straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge what was happening. "Sir," Javier said, his voice calm but unyielding, "I need you to collect your belongings and step into the jet bridge." Richard didn't respond. "Sir," Sandra tried, giving him one last chance to cooperate. Nothing. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances. The little girl beside him clutched her stuffed rabbit, her eyes darting from her father to the flight attendants. Keisha felt something stir in her chest. Not sympathy, not pity, but exhaustion. It should have never gotten this far. A seat. It was just a seat. And yet, because one man refused to accept being told no, It had escalated into this. Javier leaned in. "Mr. Aldridge, if you refuse to comply, we will be forced to call security." That did it. Richard sucked in a sharp breath, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood, jaw tight, shoulders stiff with humiliation. "Let's go," Javier said, stepping aside to let him pass. Richard took one step forward, then hesitated. And for a moment, just a split second, Keisha thought he was about to turn and say something to her. But then, he just shook his head and walked away. Passengers watched in silence as he was escorted to the front of the plane. Keisha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sandra lingered for a second longer. "If you need anything, let us know." Keisha nodded. "Thank you." Then the flight attendant turned and followed Javier toward the front. The murmurs started as soon as they were gone. Passengers whispered to each other, some shaking their heads, some muttering things Keisha couldn't quite make out. But then, a voice from across the aisle spoke up. "About time," the woman with the ponytail muttered, shaking her head. A man in the row behind her let out a low chuckle. He had that coming. A few others nodded in agreement. But Keisha? She just turned back toward her window, letting the moment sink in. She wasn't proud of what happened. She wasn't happy about it either. She was just tired. Because she knew, if she had reacted any differently, if she had raised her voice, if she had done anything other than sit quietly and hold her ground, this story might have ended very, very differently. That was the part that stung the most. And yet, despite it all, despite the stress, the confrontation, the humiliation Richard had tried to force upon her, she didn't regret a thing, because in the end, she hadn't moved. And that was enough. This story isn't just about a man who lost his temper over a seat. It's about power, about ego, about how some people will do anything to avoid being told no. And for people like Keisha, saying no, standing firm, refusing to shrink, refusing to give in to pressure, can sometimes feel like an act of defiance. But it shouldn't, because respect isn't optional. It isn't up for negotiation. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stay right where you are. If you've ever had an experience like this, or if you've ever witnessed one, I want to hear about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more. Because trust me, there's always more to talk about.